Hello everyone, welcome to this video on how global energy and environmental trends affect local communities. In this video, we are going to talk about global trends and developments and how they impact local communities. The trends that we are going to talk about can be considered exogenous to a certain degree, with local communities being exposed to those trends. That is, there is limited action to influence those trends from an individual perspective, but those trends are influenced by the aggregate actions of many individuals. The professional services network Ernst & Young has a report on global trends titled "Are You Reframing Your Future, or is the Future Reframing You?", which serves as a nice summary linking global trends to local community activities. There are multiple examples of relatively slow-moving trends, such as aging and urbanization, climate change, and also efforts to decarbonize the economy. That is, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate climate change. Climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions are closely linked. Negative effects of climate change are practically unavoidable at this point, and the goal is to stop it from getting worse. This is where decarbonization efforts come into play. The video looks at those decarbonization efforts through the lens of the transportation sector and agriculture. There are more recent examples of global shocks that could potentially lead to global trends. For example, inflation or the spike in energy prices, as well as the war in Ukraine and its influence on food security. Note that some of those megatrends reports that we will look at in a minute have identified multipolar worlds, i.e., that is, a world that is dominated by multiple economies instead of one. This relates to the geopolitical situation with Russia attacking Ukraine right now, and some countries, such as China and India, abstaining from the UN resolution demanding a full withdrawal of Russian forces. For the remainder of the video, we will focus mostly on long-term, slow-moving trends. Being aware of those trends will help make adequate decisions about the future and what type of investments are necessary today. This video provides an overview about global megatrends and how some organizations think about those megatrends. Then we are going to look at some specific trends that are commonly named and are recurring topics. Those trends are going to be demographic change, climate change, and we will see that a lot of the reports also talk about decarbonization, and we are going to look at it from a transportation sector lens. And then at the end, we are going to talk about more overarching topics, including the conclusion. Local communities are exposed to global trends, but of course, there's also a feedback effect to global drivers. This graph from the paper, A Review of Global Linkages in Economic Land Use Cover Change Models, is a neat way to present the interactions at various levels. The graph is used in the context of agriculture and land use change, but serves well for the more general purpose described in this video. At the top, you have global drivers such as population dynamics, economic growth, and climate change. Those drivers influence local levels regarding, for example, policies, but also market outcomes. Those local changes then trigger behavioral changes in production or preferences, which then have an effect at the global level. One such change in preferences may be the tendency of consumers to become vegetarian or vegan, or simply reduce their meat consumption. Especially red meat, such as beef, has a large carbon footprint contributing to climate change. You can also think about a firm that is concerned with climate change. Then the firm is going to change their production process, and if many or all firms are doing the same, then there is a feedback effect back to actual climate change. It could also be that there are state and local climate change policies which would result in the same outcome. Okay, so this is what we are going to talk a little bit about the video, where we are looking at those global drivers and how they have a local impact. Now, let us look at some global megatrends. Now, what do we mean by megatrends or global trends? It turns out that when looking at the literature, there is a significant interest in business, finance, and national security defense circles on global megatrends. They are interested in how those trends transform global society and how that transformation affects US society. Businesses and the finance industry is mostly concerned how it affects their future business and how they can take advantage of increasing profits. A few examples that we are going to look at are listed here. The Global Trends 2040 report is published by the National Intelligence Council, which is a government agency. But we also have reports from PricewaterhouseCoopers that look at 5 megatrends and their implications for global defense and security. And lastly, the report that I was talking about in the introduction is from Ernst & Young and is titled, "Are you reframing your future, or is the future reframing you?" Note that there are many other reports that are talking about or analyzing those global megatrends. Now, let us look at the first report that is from the National Intelligence Council. Those global trend reports are published every 4 years, and the National Intelligence Council is responsible for long-term strategic analysis. You can think about that they are imagining how the world is going to look like in the future. I'm going to move you through the 3 most recent reports from 2012, 2017 and 2021. You will see, and we are going to pick up this up later, that there are multiple common threads and common themes, not only in the reports from the National Intelligence Council, but also from other reports of businesses. The 2012 report focuses on 4 large trends: individual empowerment, diffusion of power, demographic patterns, and food-water-energy nexus. Let's first have a look at individual empowerment. Poverty reduction and a huge growth of the global middle class with greater educational attainment and better healthcare are the result of this individual empowerment. The majority of the world's population will not be impoverished anymore. The middle class becomes an important social and economic sector in the vast majority of countries, not only in the United States. The National Intelligence Council believes that individual empowerment is the most important megatrend because of its interaction and feedback loop effects with other trends such as expanding global economy, rapid growth of the developing countries, and also new communications and manufacturing technologies. They also state that, on the one hand, we see the potential for greater individual initiative as key to solving the mounting global challenges over the next 15 to 20 years. Now, when it comes to diffusion of power, and note that this is a trend that is picked up by multiple reports, we talk about the fact that Asia will surpass North America and Europe in terms of global power based on gross domestic product or income, population size, military spending, and technological investment. The National Intelligence Council notes that the health of the global economy will depend on how well those developing nations or how well the developing world does. An important trend, and that we are going to look at in more detail soon, are the demographic patterns or changing demographic patterns. Specifically, we have aging, migration, and also urbanization. They state migration will become more globalized as both rich and developing countries suffer from workforce shortages. Recall that we are seeing, for a very different reason, a shortage in labor supply right now. And we will look at those consequences in more detail soon when we are talking about government finance. Now, the fourth one, the food, water, and energy nexus, is basically concerned about climate change, in the sense that the severity of existing weather patterns will intensify, with wet areas getting wetter and dry and arid areas becoming more so. We are not necessarily headed into a world of scarcities, but policymakers and the private sector will need to be proactive to avoid such a future. This is also in line with academic literature suggesting that unrestricted trade among countries is more important in addressing food security in the presence of climate change than the negative effect of climate change on crop yields. Climate change also relates to the current situation which we are seeing in the Ukraine and Russia. Both countries are expected to benefit from climate change in the sense that crop yields are projected to be higher under global warming, but if there are any export restriction or production obstacles, then those obstacles are going to have a larger impact on global food security if conflicts like the current one occur in the future. Think about that Ukraine and Russia, they can both produce more food because we have higher yields from climate change. But if for some reason there are restrictions of exporting or producing that food, because they are going to be able to compensate for the crop yield reduction in other countries, then this is going to be consequential on global food security. Although this video is about long-term trends, there is also a connection with short-term shocks. So, for example, let us consider the high gasoline prices which we have seen over the last couple of weeks. Now, from an economic perspective, you cannot compare 1980 gasoline prices to 2020 gasoline prices if you do not take inflation into account. So when you're taking inflation into account, then what you're seeing is that gasoline prices in the past have been more or less comparable to what we are observing up to recently, okay? Not the most recent spike. But note that a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago, I was also interested in the fact that fuel efficiency, or that cars are getting more fuel efficient over time. And the result of this graph, or the result of this analysis, I have summarized in this graph, okay? So here I'm talking about what is depicted here is the 1976 to 2020 cost per mile of new vehicles. Okay, so what's going on here? Think about cars that are sold in 2020. Those cars have a higher fuel efficiency than cars that are sold in 1976. Now, what you're interested in driving a car is not necessarily the cost of gasoline, but the cost per mile, okay? In the sense that you are demanding a traveling service going from A to B, and you would like to know of how much it costs you. It turns out that since since the fuel efficiency of vehicles was much lower in 1976, that the cost per mile was actually significantly higher in that time period for new vehicles, and that it has decreased over the recent decades. When I did the calculation, I discovered that gasoline prices would have to be over $6 per gallon in order to make the cost per mile equivalent to 1980. Okay, so here we have a short-term shock of high gasoline prices, also high oil prices, but there's also a bigger picture about the long-term downward trajectory of fuel efficiency or fuel economy. Okay, another example of how to connect short-term shocks to long-term trends is the war in Ukraine and food security. So what you are seeing here is the Food and Agriculture Organization Food Price Index, Okay, think about this as an index that captures food prices at a global level, and you see that in recent months, this food price index has increased significantly. Here again, we are having the still effects of supply chain issues from the COVID-19 pandemic, but then we also have, and this is not quite included in the graph yet, and I think it is actually to a certain degree, is the war in the Ukraine, okay, where Ukraine and Russia are important maize and wheat exporters, and hence, since both countries are now engaged in a war, then there is the question of how well can those countries, especially the Ukraine, how well can they actually export? And you see that this then results in an increase in the food price index. How it connects with a long-term trend is climate change. As mentioned before, Russia and Ukraine are expected to benefit from climate change because it's getting warmer and yields are going to increase, and then those countries can produce more. But if they were to be engaged in a long-term war, or in a very long, or if something like this happened in the very long term, then this would have a significant effect, even more than already, on food security. Now, in all those reports, there are recurring trends coming up again and again and again. We have seen that demographic change, such as aging and urbanization, is coming up, and that we also have concerns on the use of the environment and natural resources. So think about here that we have climate change as a slow-moving process, which is affecting all aspects of life. Okay. Another trend, and that we are not going to talk about, is this shift in global economic power. Now again, what we are going to do next is we are looking at those large trends such as the demographic change, aging, and climate change, and look at how those trends are affecting local communities. Okay. Now, let us look at some of the trends in more detail, and we are going to talk about demographic change. Now, let us first provide an overview about the demographic change. And when you are looking at the 2017 national population projections, which are conducted by the US Census Bureau, you see that people 65 and older, or the share of people 65 and older, will increase from 15% in 2006 to 23% in 2060. Now, there are issues associated with having an aging population, and the two issues that we are looking at are social security and discretionary spending, and also the design of livable cities given aging and urbanization. To better understand why aging is a problem when it comes to government spending, we have to dive a little bit into public finance. In the United States, you have two large spending categories of the federal government. You have discretionary spending, and you also have mandatory spending. Now, the discretionary spending flows through an annual appropriation process, and Congress can adjust the spending levels as they deem fit. Now, mandatory spending, on the other hand, is not part of the regular appropriations process, in the sense that the Congress cannot change the spending levels associated with the mandatory spending. But mandatory spending is a formula that benefits people, and the biggest problem are Medicare and Medicaid. Now, Medicaid and also Medicare, you can differentiate them that one of them is means tested, whereas the other one is non-means tested. So means tested means that the assistance depends on the economic status of recipients, for example, Medicaid. And non-means tested is that the assistance is based on the demographic or other eligibility criteria. For example, if you're thinking about Medicare, then everybody on Medicare is automatically enrolled in the program if they are above 65 years old. And that is not dependent on their economic status. As you can see, if a society, or here in the US, if people get older, then the amount spent on mandatory spending is increasing. So if you look at the time period from, say, 1962 to 2016, then the discretionary spending as a share of total budget was 74% in 1962 and it decreased to 30% in 2016. Now, on this picture, on this plot, you see how the discretionary and mandatory spendings have evolved in real terms since 1962. Note that this graph or this plot is taken from the Office of Management and Budget, which is a White House agency. You can see that the mandatory spendings have increased significantly over time, and that the share of mandatory spendings as a percentage of overall spendings have been increasing over time. What this means is that the share of discretionary outlays, so remember that discretionary outlays are those that Congress has control over, has decreased from approximately 75% to 25% over the period from 1962 to 2021. This is important because remember that some of the discretionary spending is actually passed from the federal government to states as well as to local communities. Hence, if you have an increase in the mandatory spending, or put differently, if you have a decrease in the discretionary spending, that means that there is also possibly less money coming to the states. Now, those problems with the financing of Social Security or social insurance have been known for a long time. So until the mid-1980s, the financing was handled as a pay-as-you-go basis, in the sense that the premiums collected in a particular year covered also the benefits paid out in that year. But when you have an aging population, that means you also have a reduction in the workforce, and hence the ratio of workers to beneficiaries was drastically falling over time, in the sense that the payments that were collected in one year did not cover the benefits that had to be paid out in a particular year. Now, the reason for this change in the ratio is that we have low birth and death rates, or lower birth and lower death rates, say in 2019 than we had in the 1960s. You also have seen a retirement of many baby boomers, and that resulted that in 1960 you had about 5 workers for each recipient, and it is expected that by 2013 that ratio is 2 to 1. In the sense that 2 workers would have to pay for 1 recipient. We also see that there is an increase in healthcare costs over time, which expanded or which increased the mandatory spendings. Now, a possible solution would be that you pay into a fund during your working years and that you receive the principal plus interest upon retirement. That system would basically result that each individual worker who pays into social insurance is basically accumulating this money over time and then is getting paid interest at the end. So you would be responsible, so you would be paying your social insurance yourself when you're retiring, by the income you have earned in the previous or during your working years. Now, there are also other aspects related to an aging population. And this is important, or this has important implications for cities like Indianapolis, for example. So the World Health Organization, they have published what they call a global age-friendly cities framework, and it lists areas of priorities to make cities more livable for older people. This framework includes 8 areas of priority which are listed on this slide. As you can see, those areas are designed to make it more comfortable for senior citizens to live in a city. Now, this also relates back to what we have seen before about the budget concerns, in the sense that in order to implement this framework and, for example, expand transportation or outdoor spaces for senior citizens, that you need money for that. Very often, cities alone do not have the financial resources, but rely on outside grants from either the state or the federal government to actually construct such spaces or expand their transportation network to better serve senior citizens. Now, the next topic that we are going to talk about is climate change. Now, before we start to talk about the effects of climate change on local communities, let me present this newspaper article from a newspaper in New Zealand. And the article says, the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. Now, this newspaper article describes what are called the physical aspects of climate change, in the sense that we are burning fossil fuels. In the atmosphere, it reacts with oxygen, and that it creates the blanket, and it heats up the Earth temperature, and that there may be effects in a few centuries. Now here, this article says that there may be effects in a few centuries, and now we know today that those effects may actually come very soon. Now, what is very special about this article is not necessarily that it summarizes those physical aspects of climate change very neatly, but that this article was actually published in 1912. So this was over 110 years ago. This is also the reason why the article talks about the climate change effects being considerable in a few centuries and not in a few decades. Now, when we are talking about climate change, we have to differentiate between the physical and the social aspects of climate change. Think about the physical aspects of what was described before, in the sense that you have this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increasing the temperature. And we have seen this temperature increase over the last decades. Now, we also have, on the other hand, the social aspects, and this is what we are going to talk about in this video. In the sense that the social aspects relate to the issue of, we know that the temperature is heating up, then what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And what type of policies should we implement? And here the focus is on the energy and environmental policies. Now note that so far a lot of the research has been on avoiding greenhouse gas emissions by implementing carbon policies, and that now the sector or the focus of the attention has shifted to more of the adaptation aspects, in the sense that given that we have climate change, how is it going to affect the planet, and what can we do to reduce the effects of climate change? And here in this video, we are going to focus on agricultural and transportation policies. Note that there are very complex interactions between policy designs, climate change, and human behavior. Now, from the economic perspective, the view on climate policy is relatively easy, if you will, in the sense that the problem with climate change is that individuals do not incorporate the cost associated with carbon emissions in their individual decisions. For example, if I'm driving around in my car, then my car, which is not an electric car, is emitting carbon emissions, but I do not take those carbon emissions or the cost associated with those carbon emissions into account. Now, the economic solution is very simple in the sense that we just have to price carbon emissions in order for individuals, and that includes consumers as well as firms, to take the damage caused by carbon emissions into account. Because if we are pricing carbon, that changes the relative prices between products, and it increases the price of carbon emitting items. So for example, if you are purchasing red meat, for example beef, as opposed to chicken, then beef has a much higher carbon footprint than chicken. Now, if we are pricing carbon emissions associated with the production of red meat, not only the production, but also not only the production in a meat processing plant, but also the emissions that are happening before, that would increase the price of beef significantly, and hence it would make beef more expensive relative to chicken, and hence consumers would be switching from beef to chicken, okay, which would reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is the easy view of economists, okay, but we also have to take into account that there is human behavior, and we also have to think about distributional aspects of climate change policy. And I will talk about this in a bit. But basically, when we are talking about human behavior, then humans are driven by incentives presented to them, and that there may be adverse or unintended consequences associated with policies. And it is very important not to lose the sight of the big picture in an interconnected world. Now, let me give you an example about the unintended consequences associated with the carbon policy. A couple of years ago, there was the idea of taxing methane emissions from meat production, specifically from cattle production in the United States. It was a proposed rulemaking by the EPA that did not go anywhere, but research has shown that if you are taxing beef producers in the United States, that beef producers would actually reduce their number of cattle, because now it becomes more expensive. To actually produce red meat, but that the consumption of beef in the United States is very inelastic. What this would result in is that the demand for beef would not change by a lot, but you now have a reduction in the beef supply, and that reduction in the beef supply has to be, in domestic beef supply in the United States, has to be compensated by an import of beef from other countries. Other countries would actually see an increase in their beef production, and it turns out that the US uses very little pasture to produce beef, and that you have other countries where, for example, think about Brazil, where they have a lot of cattle, and if those other countries were to expand their beef production or their cattle herd size, that it would actually increase the greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. Okay, so here you would have this unintended consequence that a cattle tax in the United States would actually shift the emissions from the US to other countries and would actually result in an increase in emissions. So we really have to take into account those the human behavior as well as the economic aspects and incentives that are laid out to firms as well as consumers. Now, what do I mean by taking into account the distributional aspects of climate change? Now here, what I'm going to show next is based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey in the United States. And you also have the same issues in other countries as well. Note that the Consumer Expenditure Survey is conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And basically what it does is it asks consumers in the United States on what they spend money on. Okay, so which items do they purchase and how much do they consume of each item and what is their expenditure on those items. Now note that this is conducted on an annual basis by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and what I'm going to present next is based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey from 2020. Now let us have a look at some of the results of the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and some of those results are presented in this table. In the first column, you have the income decile, in the sense that you have the households in the United States, and in the first decile, the 10% of households with the lowest income are members of this decile. The 10th decile means that if you are dividing all the households in the United States in equal groups or in 10 groups of equal size, then the top 10 households are in the 10th decile, and you can see that their income before tax is reported in the second column, in the sense that the average income of the top 10% richest households in the United States is about $290,000, whereas the average income of the 10 lowest income households is about $7,100. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the difference between income before tax and income after taxes. Now, the income before tax is what they earn from wages, and the income after tax is after the households have either gotten a refund or have paid their taxes. Now, there are not only refunds, but also other transfer payments. Now, what you can see here in this graph, and this is very interesting, is that for the 40% of households at the bottom of the income distribution, that their income after taxes is higher than the income before taxes. And even if you're taking the 50% of the 50% of households at the lower end of the income distribution, you see that they are almost paying no taxes. What this means is that 50% of households in the US are basically considered from a tax standpoint so poor that they are actually receiving transfer payments from the government. Now, if we are thinking about the distributional impacts of a carbon tax, now a carbon tax would make certain products more expensive. Before I have talked about, for example, beef prices, but it would also make energy like natural gas and gasoline, it would also make those categories more expensive. Now, in the last column, you actually see where we have the energy share, and that is the expenditure on natural gas, on heating, on electricity, on gasoline, as a share of total income by decile or income decile. And you can see that the lowest decile, they are spending about 8% on energy, and the highest decile are spending only about 3.8% of their income on energy-related expenditures. So what this means is that if we were to include or if we were to impose a carbon tax, which would make energy more expensive, then it would actually hit the low-income households much harder than it would hit the high-income households, because they are spending a higher share on energy. Now, you have those issues in other countries as well, in the sense that a carbon tax would be what is called regressive, in the sense that it would, the more income you make, the less you're actually, the less you're spending percentage-wise on the carbon tax. Now, one solution would be to actually implement transfer payments, in the sense that you have revenue from the carbon tax, and there is the discussion that what should happen with those revenues. And one possible way would be to use those revenues to compensate low-income households for their higher expenditure in energy-related items. Now, this video is about the impacts on climate change or energy policy, energy and environmental policy on local finance or on local communities. Okay? Remember that we have those megatrends like climate change that are affecting local communities. And now the second example is how climate change affects local government finances. Now note that this is a graph or a figure that I have borrowed from the paper called Climate Change Will Increase Local Government Financial Stress in the United States, and it appeared in the journal Nature Climate Change. You can see that we have the climate shocks and trends. So here you can think about the trends, which are long-term trends, as we have talked before, in the sense that we have a planet that is heating up, or that we also have aging, etc. And then we have shocks that are more short-term. Okay, think about a climate shock like, for example, a really bad weather events, etc. Now, this climate-related shocks and trends, they have an impact on revenue as well as on expenditure of state and local governments. Those impacts could be, for example, the destruction of property, or if you're thinking about coastal communities where the property value declines. Now, those property destruction, this property value decline, they have effects on the revenue stream. So, for example, if you have a property value decline, that also means that you're going to have fewer property or less property tax revenue. And hence, if you have less property tax revenue, then this means you also have less revenue that you can spend on schools and education or infrastructure, for example. Okay? But if the property destruction would actually come from, say, you have infrastructure, you have flooded streets, or you have streets or roads that cannot handle the high heat, then this infrastructure has to be repaired by the local government, and hence you have an increase in expenditures. Okay, so there is a feedback loop between the climate change, or not a feedback loop, but you have those effects between revenue and expenditures. Okay, that are both affected by climate shocks and trends. And note that those effects are negative. Now, there are many more impacts of climate change on the economy, and here is a list of additional impacts. And I have taken this list from a paper that is called Quantifying Economic Damages from Climate Change, that was written by Maximilian Aufhammer and appeared in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Okay? So we have seen that we do have impact of climate change, for example, on agricultural commodity yields. We have talked about this impact, for example, in the context of the Russia and Ukraine war. But you also have sea level rises, you have climate change impacting energy. So think about, for example, if you have a hydroelectric dam that is producing energy based on the water that is in the lake behind the dam, if there is a change in the precipitation pattern, or if you have a higher demand for water out of the dam downstream because farmers have to actually irrigate their fields, then that will also affect energy production. Of course, we also have effects on the mortality. Think about if we have high heat, then usually older people are more affected by the high heat than younger people, in the sense that we may see an increase in the mortality. We also have other aspects like pollution and storms, and also there is also potential for crime and conflict. Remember that I was talking about those megatrend reports at the beginning of this video, for example, from the National Intelligence Council, where they think about the climate change as imposing a threat to national security, because you are also having conflicts in other parts of the world that then are affecting the national security of, for example, the United States. Okay. Now, let us have a look at the last topic, and that is about transportation. Now, in the United States, as well as in the European Union and elsewhere, there is the desire to decarbonize the road transportation sector. And we have talked about this decarbonization before in this video. On one hand, we have increasing fuel efficiency in the sense that cars are getting more fuel efficient and that they're using, on a per mile basis, they're using less and less fossil fuels such as gasoline and diesel. On the other hand, you also have the desire to increase the number of alternative fuel vehicles, and the most common among those alternative fuel vehicles are electric vehicles. Now, there are numerous policies in the European Union and in the United States to increase alternative fuel vehicles, but also to increase the fuel efficiency of cars. Now, the desire to increase the number of electric vehicles assumes that the emissions from producing the energy for those vehicles, or producing the electricity for those vehicles, comes from low carbon sources. Now, there are consequences of the road transportation sector decarbonization in the US and in the EU that are slightly different. For example, in the United States, you have road and infrastructure funding that comes from fuel taxes, taxes on gasoline and diesel. At the federal level and as well as at the state level, the revenue from the gasoline tax and fuel taxes is used for maintaining the roads. And as you know, in the past, there have been problems with maintenance of the road in various parts of the United States, and also, for example, in Indiana and in Indianapolis. When vehicles become more fuel efficient, or even if you are having if you have fewer gasoline vehicles and you have more electric vehicles, that means there is a decrease in the fuel tax revenue, and hence there is less money available to actually fix road and infrastructure. In the European Union, the situation is slightly different, because the European Union has what is called an emission trading system. This emission trading system is basically an environmental policy that is capping or limiting the emissions from electric utilities. More specifically, they are using what is called a cap-and-trade framework. Now, the road transportation sector in the European Union is not covered under this emission trading system, or in the sense that the road sector is not limited by the environmental policy, but electric utilities are. Now, if there is a shift of the European Union car fleet towards more electric vehicles, and this electricity is produced by non-renewable sources such as natural gas or coal, and those utilities are capped by the environmental policy or are part of the emission trading system, what this means is that the transportation sector, which was previously outside of this emission trading system, is now implicitly moving under the emission trading system, and hence it gets more and more difficult for electric utilities to produce the required electricity for electric vehicles if they are actually limited in their emissions. In the European Union, it is expected that this would increase the price on carbon emissions that is currently prevailing in the emission trading system. But note that this overall trend of decarbonizing the road transportation sector, making cars more fuel efficient, or increasing the number of electric vehicles, actually also has implications at the local level. Now, this graph here is taken from the 2021 Indiana Handbook of Taxes, Revenues and Appropriations, and it shows of how the transportation funding in Indiana is actually split out to various counties. So you can see that you have, for example, the gasoline use tax, which goes to this, for example, this state highway fund, but also the motor vehicle highway account, and that those funds are then used, also distributed back to the local level, for example, to cities and towns or to counties that then receive money from this state gas tax fund all the way down to the county level and also local government, which means that if gasoline tax revenue is decreasing, for example, from more fuel-efficient vehicles or from additional electric vehicles, that this trickles down, so to say, also to local governments and also cities and towns. Now, the counties and also the cities and towns can do very little to stop this trend of electric vehicles at the national level, or even from how car manufacturers produce those, that car manufacturers actually producing those vehicles, but they are still affected by it. Now, a solution would be, for example, to charge an additional electric vehicle registration fee, but there are also issues in terms of economic efficiency associated with those fees. For example, if you're thinking about a person owning an electric vehicle that is only driving, say, 2,000 miles per year, as opposed to a person that is using the electric vehicle to commute and drives 10,000 miles per year, if there is a flat registration fee that is equal for both drivers, then theoretically that is inefficient because the person driving the 10,000 miles is doing significantly more damage to the road than the person who is only using the car to drive 2,000 miles. But I think that this graph here shows you very neatly of how changes in the transportation sector of more electric vehicles, more fuel-efficient cars, how it actually has this effect on gasoline tax and how it goes all the way down to counties and cities and towns. Another implication of more electric vehicles and more fuel-efficient vehicles is actually caused by the consumption of biofuels in the United States. Now, this is just to give you a little bit of a history of biofuel use, a very short history of biofuel use in the US. There has been for a long time a chemical called MTBE has been used as an additive for gasoline to raise the octane level in gasoline, or basically, to put it simply, to make it more efficient. MTBE has been banned due to health concerns, and it turns out that mice ethanol serves as a substitute for MTBE, in the sense that it can increase the octane level in gasoline cars. There have been also other concerns, in the sense that there was the concern about energy independence and also greenhouse gas emissions that led to the political support for domestic mice ethanol in the US. This has led to a significant increase in the mice demand, and this has not been without controversy. Note that this ban of MTBE, the desire for energy independence and the desire to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, are only part of the equation that actually led to the increase in mice ethanol demand. In 2008, you also had high oil prices, which led to higher gasoline prices. And since you can think from an economic perspective of ethanol being a substitute, because it is also energy, that there was a switch away from gasoline because it was now more expensive towards ethanol, which was relatively less expensive. Now note that there is this, to understand what is going on there with the substitution, you also have to think about this economic principle, which is basically called the law of one price. It says that two products cannot have two different prices. If you're thinking about this in the context of gasoline and ethanol, then what you're not purchasing is a gallon of gasoline or a gallon of ethanol, but you're purchasing the energy content that is embedded in the gasoline and embedded in the ethanol. It turns out that at the time, the relative price, or the law of one price, wasn't quite holding for gasoline and ethanol, in the sense that ethanol was significantly cheaper than gasoline on an energy basis. This was because at the time corn prices were very low, and hence the corn price did not incorporate the energy content that you can gain from ethanol production. This has then changed in recent years, which increased the price of corn as well. But now what happens if we actually have additional electric vehicles, and what happens to rural and local communities in the United States? You have to think about that currently about 1/3 of global production, of global mice production, is produced in the US. And that about 1/3 of US production, of US mice production, is used for ethanol. Hence, if we have additional electric vehicles on the road, then 1/3 of that US mice production, or the demand for US mice, is declining in the long run. This has welfare implications for farmers and also for consumers, in the sense that because we have a lower demand for mice, that will also decrease the price of mice, and it will change the land allocation at the farm level, at the rural level. But since we now also have a lower price, that also means that the revenue for farmers is going to decrease. There are also interactions with climate change and food prices to think about. Now, let us conclude this video and look at some other aspects. There are many more challenges and opportunities related to those long-term trends, and also how those long-term trends affect local communities. We said before that we have climate change that will affect food security and also food prices, and that we have these crop yield impacts of climate change. Also in the US, crop yields are expected to decline in the long run, which then results also in changes to welfare in rural communities and also in farm communities. But there are also new opportunities for farmers and landowners to mitigate carbon emissions. For example, there is the concept of carbon farming, because it turns out that land can actually store a lot of carbon in the soil and in biomass. And so there are now firms that are paying farmers to store more carbon, basically to sequester or suck carbon out of the atmosphere, to store it in soil and biomass in exchange for a payment. So there is a new revenue source that could potentially open for farmers. There's also the desire to increase the number of anaerobic digesters in the United States. Basically what anaerobic digesters do is you have a large tank and you can put, for example, manure from animals in there, you can put biomass in there, and then it decomposes anaerobically. And during this decomposition process, you are producing biogas. That biogas can then be used to heat buildings on the farm, or it can be upgraded to renewable gas, which then can be used as a substitute for natural gas. For example, the policy situation in California at the moment is such that the manure produced by a dairy cow is half as valuable as the milk, because the manure can be used in an anaerobic digester, produce methane, and can then be upgraded to renewable natural gas. And the farmers can receive money or payment for this renewable natural gas that they are producing. In conclusion, we can say that we have climate change, we have multiple challenges at the global level that are all trickling down also to the local level. Especially when it comes to climate change, there is the need for collective action, in the sense that it cannot be used by individual action. From an economic perspective, this individual self-interested actions would, without any constraints, would actually lead to externalities. The example that I have done before is, for example, if I drive my car, my gasoline-powered car, then the carbon emissions that my car is exhausting are causing damage at the global level. We also have to minimize the unintended consequences by integrated approaches. Here, the example I have given in this video was the beef tax in the United States. That would actually result in more greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere, because we have an expansion of pasture in other countries. But also, we have to think about the distributional aspects of climate policy and how they are important from a societal and political viewpoint. In the sense that we cannot simply say we are going to impose a carbon tax without thinking about the distributional implications for low-income households. Again, there are many other trends, mega trends, that are affecting the globe and that will be transforming the societies in the future. And we have to think about how to handle them and how to also dampen the effects at the local level.